podcast is brought to you by Schema Business School.
Hello, welcome aboard. Welcome to the seminar on globalization. Coming next, we are going to discuss global competitiveness. It has become a fashionable, almost a buzzword, for both banks, insurance companies, and even countries. But what does it mean to be globally competitive? Well, definitely it has nothing to do with cheap price. Companies such as Apple, Porsche, LG are definitely competitive. A bank like HSBC probably also, maybe BNP. And countries such as Singapore, Chile, and Mauritius are competitive. They attract a lot of foreign direct investment and capital flows. Last year, it's a French company, Continental, from the city of Foix, that won the Industrial Competitive Excellence Award over BMW. Why? This company is competitive in each of its management settings. What does it mean? What is competitiveness all about? Well, Porter comes up, with this diamond. And he says that competitiveness is a byproduct of a number of elements, including microeconomic issues, macroeconomic, basically the country's industrial situation, but also institutional variables. Institutional variables, I mean all the legal, regulatory framework which are not conducive to good business conditions. Now, how can countries boost their competitive edge? Well, probably there are three main strategies. The first one is to boost productivity, of course, to do more with less. That requires good management, training, R&D. Number two, they can cut cost. Which cost? We shall see. Taxes, labor cost, exchange rates. And last but not least, they can or they must improve efficiency and product quality. That's at the heart of the challenge of competitiveness between France and Germany. How to measure now how a country or a company is competitive? Well, definitely the market share of exports. Number two, cost. Number three, exchange rates. Then productivity, technology, R&D, training, education. And last but not least, we shall look at a couple of ratings and rankings. But a key measure of how a company or even a country is competitive is market share. Indeed, market share is the reflection of the ability to deliver goods and services that meet global standards in a free market competition. If we look, in fact, at developed and developing countries, rich developed countries live beyond their means. We know that. We know that the US trade deficit gets very large, around $500 billion per year. It is financed by China. China, in fact, is helping the US to live beyond its means. Imports are larger than exports. However, developed countries, including the US, remain highly competitive in high value added goods and services. In a nutshell, they run a surplus in knowledge intensive exports. In the meantime, developing countries run a surplus in relatively low capital intensive products manufacturing and primary resources, raw materials, oil, gas, and so on. Now, how to boost market share? Well, one strategy is to reduce the price of the domestic goods in the foreign markets, i.e. in foreign currencies. One strategy is exchange rate depreciation, but that's dangerous. It's a last resort weapon, in fact prohibited or tightly controlled by the IMF, as this can quickly turn out into competitive devaluations. Back to square one. It's definitely a zero-sum game, as it has been the case in the 1930s, at the time of the Great Depression. In the case of France, a large number of devaluations in the 60s, 70s, 80s basically led to nowhere. The French exports market share are back to what they were in 1948. And the euro is not to be blamed. In fact, the French exports market share within the Eurozone has declined from 16% in 2000 to around 12% today. So the so-called strong euro is not a challenge within the Eurozone. Competitiveness has to be found elsewhere. Asia is catching up with the OECD, with developed countries, in terms of how competitive their exports are. However, though these countries are moving into high value-added exports, the export unit value measures indicate they're still exporting less high-tech products, less sophisticated manufacturing products. There's still a large gap, in fact, regarding the sophistication of their exports between Asian, or more widely developing countries, and developed countries. In fact, developed and developing countries do not run in the same race category. Even though developing countries benefit from technology transfers to boost the added value of their exports, they are still far behind the developed countries' exports. In a nutshell, the unit value of OECD exports remains much higher than in the emerging market countries. Market share and trade surplus are used to measure how competitive is a company or a country. But in fact, many countries, including China, export goods and services that rely heavily on imported inputs. So in fact, the key is measuring net export income. Take, for example, the iPhone. Producing the iPod, in China, results from an intricate production network ending with assembly in China. But in fact, half a dozen countries, get involved. And China's contribution remains below 5% of the total manufacturing cost of the iPod. The key, in fact, is decomposing the value added all along the value chain, and that's surprising. The OECD precisely has embarked on creating a net export value added database to take into account the exports produced, let's say, in Germany, which inputs coming from, say, China, Hungary, or Spain. And this gives you, for each of the main countries in the developed and developing world, the net export income. Using this whole value chain calculation, one gets some surprise. For instance, the share of foreign inputs in China's exports is large, higher than 20%, whereas the share of China's inputs in foreign currencies exports is around 16%. So all in all, the net trade surplus of China is grossly inflated. And that's bad news for the US Treasury that keeps doing a sort of China bashing, putting pressure on China to accelerate the appreciation of the yuan. The next variable behind the competitiveness gap is cost. Cost, exchange rates, inflation, taxes, and wages. Now, if we look at the exchange rate, when a country cannot cut its cost quickly enough, well, it can cut the foreign price of its domestic goods. It can devalue or it can depreciate. Well, devaluation is a sort of a nuclear war, and it is strongly monitored by the IMF. But countries can depreciate their exchange rate. That's exactly what the US has been doing since 2001, and that's also what Japan is doing with the yen, in fact today, in the summer of 2013 and the fall of 2013. The euro has been appreciating substantially until the mid-1990s, and again since 2001. In fact, the mirror image of the dollar depreciation is the euro appreciation. And today, in 2013, the euro real effective exchange rate is back to what it was in the mid-1990s. The so-called real effective exchange rate measures the purchasing power of the euro vis-à-vis all its major trading partners. So depreciating currencies is a competitive weapon, and this might lead to currency war. The winners, as you can see on the screen, are countries which managed for the last 5, 6, 7 years, to depreciate their currency's exchange rate, hence gaining competitive edge vis-à-vis their trading partners. Mexico, Korea, the US gained competitive edge vis-à-vis Japan and the euro. Tax rates and labor prices are, of course, also key inputs in competitiveness. Carlos Ghosn, says that there's a major gap between the cost of a car in Poland, Turkey, and France, and 70% of that difference, stems from taxes and labor costs, mainly social charges. The overall tax pressure in France is twice as high, as in emerging market countries. That, in fact, a major trigger of foreign direct investment moving from European countries, Sweden, France, and so on, to emerging market countries, where the overall tax pressure as a ratio to GDP is only 22% versus almost 45%. But most OECD countries, in fact, keep the corporate tax rates at around 30%. What we must look at is the actual rate paid by companies. It can be much lower. For example, in France, keep in mind the average tax rate, is around 70%, 17%. It can reach, only 8% for the large companies of the CAC 40 and around 22% for SMEs, for small and medium-sized enterprises. This, has led several officials in the EU to show that, in fact, their tax attractiveness was, in fact, much higher than can be looked at on paper. Labor cost is also a key input of competitiveness. The average cost of labor is around 26 euros in the 28 EU countries, but with wide gaps. In Portugal, it's around 12 euros, and probably this labor cost has been shrinking over the last 2 years due to the deep structural crisis going on in Portugal. Same story in Spain. It is not only the labor cost that matters, but also the labor cost growth rates, the evolution. Look, for example, at what happened in Greece. The increase in its labor cost has reached 55% in the last 10 years. In the meantime, Germany was shrinking its labor cost to just 15%, i.e. less than 2% today. It is not surprising that Greece labor, has lost its competitiveness since the 2000s. And if we look now, at country-by-country wage trends, that gives you a good idea of the labor cost strategies in the EU since 1995. The curve for Germany is almost flat, while that of Greece, and also Portugal, Italy, is going up. And of course, sharply declining since the global crisis, 2008-2009. Companies and countries can afford to pay high and higher wages if productivity gets higher, if they can produce more with less. So the key issue, is to balance productivity and wages or labor cost. And the key also is to include R&D, technology, good management to boost productivity, again, to produce more with less. So the key measure here is the so-called unit labor cost. The unit labor cost is a ratio of labor cost to the output per employee. In a nutshell, labor productivity. Productivity itself is nothing more than a ratio. It is a ratio of output divided by labor, labor measured either in number of people or in working hours. If we look here at the graph, what do we see? We have two curves for the French economy. One is wages, one is productivity. And since the late 1970s, we see that almost every year, with a few exceptions, wages evolution has been higher, larger than productivity. We have a gap between productivity increases and wages increases. And that's probably, behind some of the explanation for the narrowing competitive gap between France and its neighbor countries. As long as wages increase at the same pace as productivity, a country or a company can keep competitive. However, if we have a large gap between wage increases and productivity evolution, then there is a problem. Looking at France between the late 1970s and today, we see that almost every year, with a few exceptions, wages have increased higher than productivity. And this, in fact, is probably at the heart of the competitive gap between the French economy and its neighbor countries, and of course with the emerging market countries. Productivity growth rates have also been higher in the US than in the EU. In particular, there's a large gap in the productivity evolution, around 1.5, almost 2% per year in the US, with around 0.5 in France. Between the late 1990s and 2012, labor productivity has increased tremendously in the US, around 37%. A little bit less, 15% in Japan, and only 10% in the EU. This higher productivity has helped the US and Japan, to move ahead and to gain market share in the global economy. If we look at the productivity gap in the OECD economies, the 34 developed countries, we look at the ratio of GDP per working hours. And we use the US as a base, as an index of 100. Well, only a few countries are more productive than the US economy, namely the Irish and the Norwegian economies. Most of the other countries, including France, Germany, Belgium, are less productive. But if we look at a few developing countries, members of the OECD, namely Mexico and Turkey or South Korea, their productivity, in fact, is almost 70% lower than that of the US. A combination of higher productivity in Germany, thanks to technology, R&D, and stable labor cost, means that the unit labor cost in Germany has declined since the mid-1990s, in fact, until today. And this has given Germany a competitive edge vis-à-vis its European neighbor countries, but also vis-à-vis the US and Japan, hence boosting the dynamics of the German exports. It is not only a matter, of labor cost, of productivity, but also Germany's exports include much higher value added than the exports of other European countries. Hence, these exports are much less price elastic than exports from Spain, France, Italy, and Portugal. It means that a relatively strong euro has hurt Germany less than its neighbor countries. How many hours workers work? This is also an input in productivity. Well, the average working hours, in the 19th century were around 3,000 hours per year in France. Today, in South Korea, it's still 2,200 hours. Probably developed countries in Europe and the US don't want to compete with South Korea in terms of boosting the number of working hours. However, we can look at something interesting. For most of the developed countries, including Europe and the US, the number of working hours has declined since the 1970s and 80s until the mid-80s. In the US, the number of working hours, in fact, is stable at around 1,800. In the meantime, the number of working hours in Europe keeps shrinking in both France, Spain, Italy, and Germany to around 1,500 today. It means that there is still a gap of around 300 hours between working hours in Europe and working hours in the US. And this, in fact, allows the US economy to produce more. This graph casts light on the wide gap in the OECD countries between, let's say, South Korea and Netherlands or Germany. Labor cost is, of course, a key input of how competitive is a company or a country. we see that on average, in the developing countries, the labor cost is very low, around $2 per hour in China. It's a little bit higher in Tunisia, roughly 15 dinars per day for unskilled labor. And the labor cost in countries such as Germany and France is much higher, around $36 for Germany, and still higher, $41 for France. Countries in the developing world have in fact increased their labor cost, their wages. That's good news for these workers. It increases their purchasing power, by the way. And in fact, Tunisia, Peru have almost the same labor cost today. And Mexico is a bit higher. Countries with much labor cost are Bangladesh, Vietnam, and India. These very large labor cost differences means that the gap between a worker, an unskilled worker in Asia and in Europe can be as large as 1 to 5 or 1 to 10. The labor cost gap between an engineer in Asia and in Europe is around 1 to 5, 5 times higher in Europe than in Asia, 5 times lower in China, India, or Vietnam than in Europe. Let's look at a quick case study of China. We know that in the 1990s until 2010, until let's say the midst of the global crisis, China was highly competitive. And why? It combined low salaries, a very undervalued yuan, long working hours and low tax rates, plus cheap and very abundant bank credits. There's another story today. Probably these days, of cheap labor costs are over in China. China's labor costs have increased by close to 15-20% over the last 3 years. We have rising salaries in China. The yuan is getting stronger and stronger. Whereas in neighbor countries, competing countries, you have higher productivity, relatively lower labor cost, and for a few countries, geographic proximity of large markets. For example, Vietnam and Japan, or Mexico and the US. This is shrinking the competitiveness of China. If we look at the combination of currency revaluation of the yuan and the higher wages in China, we see a growing gap between China and its competitors, such as Vietnam, Indonesia, and India. The average annual income in China is now as large as Thailand and well above the Philippines, Vietnam, and Indonesia. It means, in a nutshell, that if China is not boosting its productivity, including with the high-tech production of goods, China's competitive edge will, in fact, shrink in the next few years. And comparing China and Mexico, we see that, in fact, not only China wages are increasing probably faster than in Mexico, but productivity-adjusted wages in Mexico will be, in the next few years, higher than in China. And of course, Mexico benefits from its strong geographic proximity of the large US market. Not surprising, then, that Mexico's market share has increased in the US at the expense of China, in particular in such key sectors as electronics, telecommunications, transportation, equipment, and the automobile sector. Mexico has been able to boost its market share at the expense of China, also thanks to the probably better transparency or better governance and the stronger protection of proprietary rights and the commitment of free trade of Mexico, which is a member, of course, of NAFTA. So, in a nutshell, wages, yes, are lower in emerging market countries, but in fact, productivity is also much lower. So these countries are not as competitive as they look. Productivity in emerging markets, is growing quickly in developing countries, but the level of productivity is much lower. Remember, in Mexico or in South Korea, productivity is probably 50–60% less than in the US. So what we have to conclude is we need to combine productivity and wages and labor costs. And this gives us a measure of how competitive are developing countries. So we are going to look at the productivity gaps between developing countries and the US and the wage gap between developing countries and the US. So the game plan is to measure two gaps, on the one side productivity and on the other the wage gap, the labor cost. For example, in the case of the South Korea, labor cost is 48% lower than in the US, that's very good, but productivity is also 46% lower than in the US. So this, in fact, allows South Korea just to be on the same level as the US economy. In the case of Italy or Greece, for example, the wage gap is much higher than in the US, and productivity is lower. Hence, competitiveness is not as good as that of the US economy. So what to do? Well, the name of the game is to boost productivity with training, education, R&D, and so on. And what do we see? Well, the level of the higher education population in countries such as in the EU gives us a measure of the intellectual investment of countries in higher education. And we see, it's a sort of surprise that in France, for example, the share of the higher educated population is only 27%, much lower than Japan, which is around 43, or much higher than in the US, for example. Another key input to boost productivity is R&D. Is it higher than 2% of GDP or lower than 1%? Well, definitely the winners are those countries who can boost R&D with substantial investment efforts above 2% of their GDP. Only a handful of countries can do it: the US, Japan, South Korea, Sweden, and Finland. China, of course, is catching up. Not only, it is the workshop, or it was the workshop of the world, but China wants also to be the brains of the world. And in the last 2 years, China increased substantially the number of patents it filed in the world, almost, in fact, bypassing the US and Japan. The fast rise, in R&D and patent applications gives us, a measure of how quickly China is catching up, not only in producing basic goods and services, but increasingly in high value-added goods and services. Let me conclude by telling you that there is also one way of measuring how competitive is a country is to get a rating, a ranking. And the WF, the World Economic Forum, gives us a comprehensive picture of competitiveness in the world by using a large number, almost 10 indicators. The latest index released by the WEF leads us to conclude that the BRICS, in fact, are not yet as competitive as one could think of. Competitive countries are still highly dynamic countries in the north of Europe, or Hong Kong, Singapore, Finland, Sweden. But definitely the BRICS are not still very competitive. They have to catch up. India is only 59, and China, the most competitive of the BRICS, it's still only 29. Definitely there is a catch up, but it will take time. Thank you.